Hi, my name is John Goldsmith, and this is the second in a series of videos that I'm making about a book that I'm currently writing along with a friend and colleague, Bernard Lax. And the working title of the book in progress is The Real Origins of Generative Grammar. And it's a follow-up to a 2019 book that Bernard and I wrote called Battle in the Minefields. So in making this video and making it a little bit of a film, I've tried to include pictures of people, especially linguists who play some role in the story, or anthropologists, philosophers. And the problem is that the pictures that we have of these people are, from when they're 60, 70, 80 years old. And the times that we're talking about are when they were 20 or 30 or 40. So it's great to have pictures of these people, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. I really would like to have younger pictures of these people when they were younger, but I don't have access to them, so I'll do the best I can, and together we'll do the best we can. Let's take a look at this chapter, which is entitled Europe Comes to New York. December 1938. Roman Jakobson was 42 years old, married, no children, Russian by birth, from a comfortable Jewish family. His parents had prepared him for a professional career, perhaps as a diplomat. As a child, he had tutors, and he learned to speak French and German as soon as he learned Russian. As an undergraduate at the University of Moscow, he studied languages, linguistics, and literature, and he founded the Moscow Linguistics Circle. He worked hard and he played hard, tried to write poetry, fell in love with Elsa Triolet, and was fast friends with avant-garde poets. Jakobson had arrived in Czechoslovakia in 1920, just after he finished his undergraduate studies. He had come as part of a Red Cross delegation that everybody knew was a sham. The Czech government in Prague did not recognize the Soviet government led by Lenin that had overthrown the socialists in November of 1917, and neither did any other country on earth. This particular Red Cross delegation was sent by the Soviet government because they couldn't send a diplomatic mission, and the Red Cross sounded like a fine name to use. What the Soviet government wanted was official recognition. But what they needed even more was intelligence about the ongoing White Russian efforts to overthrow the new Soviet government, which were especially active along the Western Front at the USSR's border with Poland. Czechoslovakia's own long border with Poland made it an especially desirable spot for Soviet espionage efforts to learn about what the White Russians were up to. Jakobson came with a Red Cross envoy as an interpreter, but left the staff as an official member as soon as he got to Prague. Even so, he remained in close touch with the mission. He spent his time exploring art and literature. And linguistics. The linguistics reminded him of Prince Trubetskoy, who he had known just a bit at the university back in Moscow. Trubetskoy was 6 years older than Jakobson. That's virtually a generation older, it must have seemed to this very young man. And more to the point, Trubetskoy was from an entirely different social stratum. Trubetskoy was a real prince. Jakobson knew Trubetskoy had left Russia by then, and he was able to track down his address, and they began a friendship by correspondence. They shared a culture, philosophy, literature, academic ambition. Jakobson in Prague was central to the establishment of a new linguistic circle, the Prague Linguistic Circle. In 1929, he wrote a manifesto for a new kind of phonology, and Trubetskoy agreed to be a signatory. Over the 1930s, they tried to put a book together with a new theory and a new analysis of Slavic phonology. Trubetskoy sensed that his time was limited, and he prioritized his own book, which he entitled Principles of Phonology. Trubetskoy didn't get to finish his last book. The Nazis moved into Austria in March of 1938. Trubetskoy was hauled in and interrogated by the Gestapo too many times, and his weak heart failed him. He was dead by June. Jakobson took the manuscript of his friend's book and managed to put it into shape for publication in 1939. But their joint book was simply not to be. Jakobson realized that he had to get out of Czechoslovakia before the Nazis arrived. On the continent, He knew everybody who was anybody in linguistics, and he managed to get an invitation to go to Copenhagen because he knew Viggo Brundal and Louis Hjelmslev there, the co-founders of the Copenhagen Linguistic Circle, both members of the Prague Linguistic Circle too. In March of 1939, Jakobson and his wife went to Denmark. He was able to stay for a few months, but headed north to Norway in August and arrived in Oslo on the 1st of September, the day that war was declared in Europe. In Oslo, he was received by his linguist friend Alf Sommerfeld, who he knew from the phonology conference he had organized for the Prague Linguistic Circle in 1930. He had an extremely productive 7 months in Oslo, but the Nazis were moving in on Norway. On April 9th, 1940, Germany demanded control of Oslo or face bombardment. The Norwegians ceded, and Jakobson and his wife took a train north with barely a moment's notice, hoping to stay a step ahead of the Nazis, fearing deportation to a concentration camp. They headed to Sweden on foot, the lot of many a refugee. On April 23rd, Jakobson turned himself in to the Swedish police and explained his situation, offering the names of several linguists in Sweden that he knew who could support his statements. Chaos is the watchword in all scenes of war, of course, and Jakobson needed to pursue all possibilities open to him to find a place where he would be safe. At first, there was even thought of going to France, where his parents were. But in the end, he waited an entire year in Sweden and left on a ship in late May 1941. He managed to book passage for his wife and himself on a boat to New York. They arrived in New York on the 4th of June, 1941. Jakobson was able to be received by the university set up by the New School for Social Research, whose president, Alvin Johnson, had seen the threat that the Nazis posed as early as 1933. Johnson had managed to obtain funding to help academics who were refugees from Nazi persecution to spend 2 years at the unit set up under the wing of the New School. Time enough, they hoped, for the refugees to find a position of some sort in the United States. Johnson has started his efforts as soon as Hitler rose to power, and for a good while the academics who were received were German-speaking. But a few months after Jakobson arrived, a new unit that was backed by the French and Belgian governments in exile was established. It was called the École Libre des Hautes Études, and Jakobson joined this new group, which was also under the wing of the New School in New York. Jakobson gave lectures on phonology and on structuralism, a term that he had coined in 1929. One of those sitting in his class was, well, now I have a problem. The name is Claude Lévi-Strauss, but that doesn't really work in English, and it doesn't even sound familiar. So I'll say Lévi-Strauss, but his name is Lévi-Strauss. And then there's another name that's about to come up, which is Alexandre Coiré or Coiré, and I'm going to anglicize it and say Coiré. All right. So one of those sitting in his classroom, sitting in on his lectures, was Claude Lévi-Strauss, the cultural attaché of the Free French, and a young anthropologist who had been working in Brazil. They, the two of them, Jakobson and Lévi-Strauss, had just been introduced by Alexandre Coiré, who was a Russian-French philosopher who was also in New York and who became the Secretary General of the École Libre des Hautes Études, which I will not anglicize. Years later, Lévi-Strauss remembered those days. And he wrote, Jakobson revealed to me the existence of a body of doctrine that had already been formed within a discipline, linguistics, with which I was unacquainted. For me, it was a revelation. They had, quote, a friendship of 40 years without a break. It's a bond that never weakened, and for me, an admiration that never ended. And of Jakobson, Lévi-Strauss wrote, He was a thinker of an intellectual power that dominated all around him. His erudition was prodigious, ranging from the linguistics of ancient India up to Husserl. He was interested in everything: painting, avant-garde poetry, anthropology, computers, biology. Jakobson's structuralism in linguistics became Levi-Strauss's structuralism in anthropology, and in 10 years' time, it would be the new intellectual wave in Paris. And years later, Jakobson looked back on those times and he wrote, "During the 40s and 50s, I came directly into contact with the outlook and interests of American scholars. Little by little, I discovered that my way of thinking, which tended more towards phenomenology and was close to the experience of the Gestalt psychologists, differed fundamentally from the ideology of the behaviorists, who still exerted a profound influence on the thought of American scholars and of linguists in particular. It would be inaccurate, however, to regard these differences as a disagreement between American and European approaches to the theory of language. Edward Sapir is an example of a researcher of genius who firmly avoided behaviorist devices, yet he is no less typical of American linguistics of the first third of the century and exerted a profound influence on the work of his students. Nevertheless, the American linguistics scene at mid-century was definitely dominated by the so-called Yale-Bloomfield school. This term is not particularly apt, for both Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield worked at Yale at the same time. Well, that's the end of what Jakobson said, and it isn't true. Bloomfield didn't get to Yale until a year after Sapir died, but it doesn't matter. Jakobson wasn't in the U.S. at that point. Change of scene now. During the summer of 1943, the War Department established a language section at 165 Broadway, no more than a block or so from where the World Trade Center would be built 30 years later. The goal of this section was to produce teaching materials to be used with soldiers sent to various theaters of operation during the war. The effort was run by a major in the Army who was a linguist in uniform, Major Henry Lee Smith, who is already known to radio listeners around the country as the man who could tell you where you were from just by listening to you talk. Major Smith located linguists and drew them to the Information and Education Division of the Army, the unit that he headed. There they developed grammars and instructional manuals for languages that would be needed by officers around the world during World War II. The linguists at 165 Broadway formed the heart of the fifth generation in the United States, the fifth generation of linguists. This is the linguists born from roughly 1905 to 1919, including such linguists as Charles Hackett, Fred Householder, and a number of others. Householder was there. He wasn't in the Army, but he was there. Amongst the linguists at 165 Broadway arose a consciousness of a group in several ways. They were, in the first instance, the vanguard of the generation of linguists taught by Sapir and Bloomfield. Sapir had just died, and this younger generation felt power in Bloomfield's ideas. And there was an us versus them attitude, where the us was American linguists, and the them was all the other linguists of the world. Many of the linguists born in the second decade of the 20th century worked in this office, developing language tools for the American Army, including Stanley Newman, Fred Householder, Charles Hackett, all the linguists we've met. Paul Garvin, who had immigrated to the U.S. in 1938 from Czechoslovakia at the age of 19, he was there as well, and so was Morris Swadesh, Raven McDavid, Robert A. Hall Jr., and Alan Walker Reed. Some of the work in the preparation of this instructional material was done at Yale in New Haven, just 2 hours north of New York City by train. The Russian materials being prepared there were born under an ill star right from the start. George L. Traeger was in charge of the project, and though Russian had been his first language, disputes over his competence in describing modern Russian were never settled in his favor. Russians were not inclined to take Odessa Russian learned in the United States as a good model for a textbook. Always feisty and cantankerous, Traeger eventually left New Haven in early 1944, and after a certain period the project was handed over to Leonard Bloomfield in the hopes that he could pull a rabbit out of a hat. Bloomfield turned to Roman Jakobson for assistance in the grammatical analysis that was contained in the first 2 years of instruction. There were now, as far as linguistics went, two distinct cultures coexisting in New York City. In one spot, there were the young Americans who had been trained by Bloomfield and Sapir at the linguistics institutes in the late 1930s, now working for the War Department. And in another spot, there were the European immigrants. There was some overlap, and there were Americans who were interested in what the Europeans were doing. But there were other American linguists a good deal less welcoming to European colleagues. There's no doubt that a strong sense of camaraderie existed among the linguists working in the 165 Broadway group. And while less than half the linguists there were in uniform, the group felt itself to be part of a larger American war effort to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. Herbert Penzel called it, in his words, a really delightful League of Nations, and Raven McDavid remembered some of these times that he spent there. He wrote, "For over 3 years I spent more time on Burmese than on anything else, but between informants, Burmans were in short supply and in great demand. I was one of Chaz's assistants," Chaz is Charles Hackett, "one of Chaz's assistants on the Dictionary of Spoken Chinese, helped with the courses in English as a second language, and like everyone else, I did what other odd jobs came to hand." But conflicts were to emerge with the European immigrants. Years later, Del Himes and John Faught wrote the following: "We can only guess as to the consequences of the concentration of a number of young linguists at 165 Broadway working on language teaching materials for the United States Army at the same time as the city became a home in exile to European intellectuals." Alan Walker Reed was 35 years old when the U.S. declared war on Germany, and years later wrote about what he called an, quote, invasion of European scholars in New York. Here's what he wrote. "When the war reached American soil in 1942, I was drafted into the Army and was so fortunate as to be assigned to a dictionary-making outfit with offices in a building overlooking the Battery on the lower tip of Manhattan. We compiled materials for a dictionary of military terms under the direction of 2 competent civilians. And then in 1943, I was especially lucky to be assigned to the language section of the War Department at 165 Broadway, where various linguistic projects were being tried out under the direction of Major Henry Lee Smith. We had many shorter-term workers who stayed for varying periods. We felt that we were carrying on an American-based linguistics and were not cordial to the intrusions of certain refugee scholars. This was resented by some of them who felt that they were superior to American scholarship." Well, Reed was not uncertain about who these ingrates were, and he wrote, "Especially difficult to deal with was Roman Jakobson, who seemed to us at that time to be overbearing and self-aggrandizing. Bloomfield, with his characteristic humility, in an interview, listened to him patiently, but Jakobson later boasted, 'I set him right on many matters.' We did recognize Jakobson's high worth, and some of the linguists with pull managed with great effort to get him a position at Columbia. Soon afterwards, he was offered a better position at Harvard and left New York without thanks for the efforts that had been made in his behalf." Yeah, well, Reed quite obviously made no effort to be politically correct in describing how he felt, and he made no effort to hide his feeling that the refugees were an ungrateful lot. And we can thank him for his frankness now, which helps us to see how some of the immigrants must have felt. We should bear in mind when reading this that Reed had become a faculty member at Columbia University in the English department in 1945, so he was one of the linguists that Jakobson left behind when he moved to Harvard in 1949. Quote, "Some of the linguists with pull managed with great effort." Is that the phrase? To get Jakobson a position at Columbia? Well, the story, as we will see, is more interesting than that and involves stepping back from individual support and animosity and looking at the role that leading American universities hope to play in the post-war world in which the United States needed to know much more about its new enemy, the Soviet Union. We'll get to that. Robert A. Hall, who viewed himself as Bloomfield's student, has written about some of the conflicts that arose at 165 Broadway. He perceived Morris Swadesh, for example, as, quote, promoting the interests of the Communist Party and recruiting for new members. This was not looked on well by all the members of this group, but the strained relations with the immigrant community was more serious. In 1969, Hall wrote the following: however, the strong anti-European feelings of many American linguists in the 1930s and 1940s had its main roots in oftentimes bitter personal experiences. Not a few Americans saw, and frequently more than once, positions for which they had been trained and were eminently qualified snatched from under their noses and given to European refugees. Now, such a reaction, though by no means generous, was easily understandable in the days of the Depression, when any job at all was hard to come by, especially since American scholars, then as now, were not protected by a citizenship requirement of the kind prevailing in virtually all European university systems. A frequent remark heard from these American scholars was, "We'll show those Europeans we have something they never dreamed of." That's the end of Hall's comments. Hall actually published a memoir that recounts his perception of the time as an American, lining up rather well with Alan Walker Reed's account. And Hall wrote, "My parents, and indeed our whole culture, had always taught me that people coming to America and settling permanently owed it to themselves and to their adopted country to discard older customs or attitudes that might conflict with those prevailing in their new homeland." And even more stridently, in my opinion, he wrote, "Such hostile tertiary reactions were, of course, not limited to Europeans. There were plenty of Americans who behaved in the same way. However, these attitudes were most virulent in refugee Europeans, many of whom had come to the United States wanting to be cock of the walk as soon as they had arrived, but had been disappointed in their expectations. As was noticed in refugees in many other fields, also, a number of them, openly or secretly, resentful at having had to accept charity from a nation concerning which they had an a priori notion that it was vulgar, materialistic, soulless, whatever other pejorative adjective they could think to use. For the generosity shown by America in taking them in and even giving them preference over its own native sons, not only were they not grateful, but they hated the United States all the more on that account. Of course, there were honorable exceptions, and among the younger men, some made their way up to the ranks and learned a great deal from their American colleagues." Whew. Several of the European immigrants who remained in the United States also have written about their perception of this time. Thomas Sibiak was a refugee from Hungary who came to the United States in 1937 at the age of 17. 2 years later, he enrolled as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, where he studied with Bloomfield during his last year at Chicago before moving to Yale. At Chicago, Sibiak was deeply influenced by Charles Morris, the philosopher. Sibiak went to Princeton in 1942 to do graduate work, but quickly decided that it was with Roman Jakobson that he wanted to work, who was up in New York. He received a master's degree in anthropology the next year and was appointed to the faculty that same year at Indiana University at the tender age of 23. There he became director of the Air Force's language training program, which prepared soldiers to pass behind enemy lines, and in 1945 he finished his PhD. Sibiak has recounted his own views of what happened during this tense period in New York towards the end of World War II. Sibiak wrote this: Jacobson's teachings were roundly condemned by an influential cabal of autochthonous and lately naturalized linguists, mostly a generation or two older than mine, clustering around 165 Broadway. In truth, these men were mostly misguided chauvinists, afflicted with a hubris doubtless induced by pressures and fears of an uncertain military conflict in the backdrop. Regrettably, the behavior of this small but powerful clique, which caused Jakobson and his friends untold anguish, to say nothing of economic loss, left a sinister stain on the otherwise magnificent tapestry of achievements of American linguistics in the 1940s. Fortunately, this dark episode was transpierced by brilliant shafts of light emanating from giants like Boas and Bloomfield. Their instant appreciation for Jakobson's decisive presence must be allowed to compensate for all the rest, which had better stay buried with other similarly motivated wartime debris. Well, Alan Walker Reed's recollections of this period were published shortly after Sebeok's recollections, and he responded to them directly, and he wrote, "It has surprised me to find that our office at 165 is described as being a cabal and a powerful clique consisting of misguided chauvinists. And Reed rejects Sebeok's version of the facts. It doesn't do a very convincing job. Here's what Reed wrote. Sebeok paints a picture very different from the one I remember. There was no chauvinism whatsoever, but at most a touch of justified nativism, a pride that helps to keep a culture's traditions in a healthy state. At best, it was a difficult problem to take care of such an influx of learned refugees, and some feelings were bound to get hurt." Well, we've already seen some of Robert Hall's recollections, which align well with Reed's. Whether we think his memories are accurate or not, nearly 50 years later, they are still enlightening. His narrative includes an account of a notorious $2 bill that was sent to Jakobson during the war from a group of linguists. This was an event that stirred tremendously strong emotions at the time, to the point where even 50 years later, we talked to linguists who remembered it well, in at least one case with great wrenching regret. Hall wrote the following. Traeger, that's George Traeger, had developed a very strong persecution complex vis-a-vis Roman Jakobson, whom he considered as a personal enemy because the latter, he thought, had done him, Traeger, out of various professional opportunities. Among the non-refugee linguists in the New York City area, there was a great deal of hostility towards Jakobson and his colleagues at the École Libre, who were widely considered to be arrogant, haughty, and self-important, but unwanted intruders. John Kepke was a friend of Traeger's, and one or two of his friends took a $1 bill, I seem to remember it was a $2 bill, but I may be wrong, and went around the office asking people to sign their names on it so that it could be sent to Jakobson as their contribution towards his and the other refugee linguists' fares to return to Europe on the first cattle boat to sail after the war was over. I emphasize the last phrase because there was no intent, even humorous, of sending them back before it was over. That was nothing more than an ill-mannered office prank in very bad taste, which has been blown up to something far beyond its real importance in the reminiscences of certain of Jacobson's henchmen. End of quotation from Hall. These comments from Hall on the state of the field, not only in this context during World War II, but over the whole course of his career, were idiosyncratic and a bit extreme, but they are, if only for that reason, of considerable interest and use to us today in getting a feel for what some of his generation were thinking and how they were responding to changes in the field. We'll see some more of comments below from his pen, which he no doubt would describe as irascible, but which many others would see as offensive. Morris Halle, who studied with Jakobson, wrote this. Jacobson arrived in the USA in the summer of 1941, in the middle of the Second World War. In spite of many efforts, he was unable to obtain a regular university appointment during the war. I know from conversations with Jakobson that he had extensive negotiations with the University of Chicago, and that Zelig Harris tried at one point to obtain an appointment for him at the University of Pennsylvania. None of these attempts was successful, and there's some indication that the failures were due to an active effort to block Jakobson from ever obtaining a regular university position in the United States. As a result, he spent the war years lecturing at l'École Libre des Hautes Études, which was organized at the New School for Social Research in New York. It was only in 1946 that Jakobson succeeded in being appointed to a regular faculty position at Columbia University. We've seen that Roman Jakobson was a lightning rod for American linguists in New York. He was not the only immigrated linguist who arrived in New York looking for a job, but the Americans were very aware that he was indeed on the job market. And he seemed to ooze a sense of knowing everything and knowing it better than anyone else. Not everybody found it to their liking, and some interpreted it as a sense of entitlement on his part. André Martinet was a French linguist who came to New York just after the war was over, just after World War II was over. He remembered what he learned when he arrived, and we can't trust everything he says here. We will read more from Martinet, and I will emphasize how unreliable some of his observations are. Still, they're interesting. He wrote this: Americans had put roadblocks everywhere. They were fine with having a war that stood in the way of Europeans coming and making things difficult for them. I'd have to say that the Europeans in the U.S. were pretty hard to take. They considered the Americans to be the bad guys, and the Americans were not very happy, and rightly so. They were quite happy to be liberated of these Europeans, of the European pressure. There were all these émigrés, largely European, German, Jews, who had all sorts of reasons to leave home. Jakobson arrives, and as soon as he does, there's this big roadblock that's installed. They were very hard on him. They called him a clown, and he was in a desperate position. End of quotation. We'll come back to Malcolm. In 1943, Jakobson set up a linguistic circle for the third time in his life, a professional group that would meet on a regular basis and present papers and have discussions. This time it was the Linguistic Circle of New York, which in the years since has morphed into the International Linguistic Association. 2 years later, the circle started its own journal called Word, which soon came to be quite the competitor with the LSA's Language. Up until the early 1960s, it was an important presence on the American linguistic scene, with an agenda that was different from that of Language, and it was the place to find new ideas about linguistics, or a place at least. It was much more open to European styles of thought, although it wasn't closed in any fashion to Bloomfieldian thought. A good number of papers in Word in the late 1940s and the early 1950s began the exploration of linguistic ideas that became central to generative phonology in the years that followed. Al Gleason recalls a perhaps apocryphal story according to which Bernard Bloch, who was editor of Language, according to this story, he sent a note to an author of an article that he had rejected, and he wrote, "I hope the author will thoroughly revise the paper for publication, perhaps in Word." Jacobson's support through the École Libre at the New School in New York came to an end in 1943. He had served his 2 years there, and that was really all they were in a position to offer. An opportunity to work as a visiting professor at Columbia University arose then, a position that he maintained for 3 years, and that was funded by the Guggenheim Foundation, until a regular appointment as a professor and a founding member of a brand new department of Slavic languages came about at Columbia University. But the story of how Columbia University embarked on a massive investment in teaching and research on the Soviet Union is fascinating, and it draws back the curtain on how social sciences and academia and government work together. While the animosities recounted by linguists during the war that we've already seen cannot be and shouldn't be ignored, or forgotten for that matter, they were dwarfed in their effect by the arrival of large amounts of money coming from the government for projects that required the teaching of foreign languages, and teaching Russian was at the very top of that list. This led to a rapid growth of demand for academic teaching of the Russian language, and this happened more than once. The first time it brought Jakobson to Columbia, and the second time it brought him to Harvard. He was the right man at the right place at the right time. We've already seen that university professors with degrees in linguistics and anthropology joined the war effort by developing language teaching materials in the project at 165 Broadway. But American universities played two other major roles in the war effort. Some universities served as the home for technological research that developed crucial technologies like radar, digital computers, and the atomic bomb. And some universities provided the academic expertise that their faculty members in the social sciences, ranging from economics and political science, anthropology, could provide. This expertise was immediately rolled into the intelligence services set up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And to understand how Jakobson was appointed as a professor at Columbia University in 1946, we have to look more carefully at American intelligence during World War II. Who would have thought that? I must say, all of this material came as a big surprise to me. Let's take a look. Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, set up the Office of the Coordinator of Intelligence, known as COI, in July of 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor and well before the entry of the United States into World War II. He appointed as its head William Donovan, a lawyer who had been serving as an advisor to Roosevelt on matters of security and intelligence in Europe since the outbreak of the war in Europe. Roosevelt and Donovan had been classmates years earlier at Columbia Law School. Donovan was often called Big Bill Donovan. In June of 1942, 6 months after the U.S. had entered the war, the COI was strengthened and renamed the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. And while it did not outlast the war under that name, it served as the foundation for the Central Intelligence Agency when the CIA was set up in 1947. The OSS did its job very well during World War II, and the federal government quickly set about to find a way to keep the good parts of the OSS alive once the war was over. Now, one of the branches of the OSS was called Research and Analysis. It was headed up by William Langer, who was a historian at Harvard University. France was his area of expertise. And R&A, Research and Analysis, remained a group thoroughly dominated by academics. It was also probably the part of the OSS which was most appreciated by the government outside of the OSS. As McGeorge Bundy observed 20 years after the war was over, quote, "The first great center of area studies in the United States was not located in any university, but in Washington, in the Office of Strategic Services. In very large measure, the area studies programs developed in American universities in the years after the war were manned, directed, or stimulated by graduates of the OSS, a remarkable institution, half cops and robbers and half faculty meetings." End of quote. A recent historian has written that the Research and Analysis Division was, quote, "the social science equivalent of the Manhattan Project." And you probably remember the Manhattan Project developed the atomic bomb during World War II. Now, the head of the division within the OSS, the OSS's Research and Analysis Group, the head of the group, the subgroup that focused on the Soviet Union, was Geroid Robinson, a historian who came directly from Columbia University, where he had been on the faculty since 1931. Now, having an American intelligence unit that was assigned to study the Soviet Union during World War II was a diplomatically sensitive matter. After all, Nearly all of the work being done by the rest of the OSS was focused on the enemies of the Allies, which meant Germany and Japan and Italy. But here was a hefty group of researchers focusing on our largest ally. The thought had occurred to many that preparations were being made for a time in the future when the Soviet Union might no longer be an ally, and that's what made it sensitive. There were valid reasons to value intelligence about what was happening inside Russia, to be sure. It was essential for the United States to know what the weak points were in the Soviet polity. The United States needed to know how much food and war material would be needed by the Soviet Union to maintain its war effort in the face of the surprise German invasion into Russia. Even if Germany could not militarily defeat the Soviet Union, a separate peace signed by Germany and the Soviet Union was not inconceivable, and such a separate peace would have disastrous consequences for the fight in the western part of Europe, where all of Hitler's forces would then be regrouped. Nobody had forgotten that Russia had backed out of its military opposition to Germany during World War I when the Tsar was overthrown. It was essential that the United States provide enough support to its ally, the Soviet Union, to remain firmly committed to defeating Hitler militarily. No error on the part of American intelligence would be more serious or more damaging to the war effort than an error that led the Soviets to withdrawing from the war that they were engaged in against Hitler. Very important point. Now, by and large, the work being done by academics in the OSS was perceived by the government as vital, and steps were soon taken to explore ways to develop a close relationship between the government and academia after the war in the development of American policy and the creation of experts in the social sciences whose focus was on other parts of the world. Even during the war, officers at the Carnegie Corporation, which is often called the Carnegie Foundation, but that's not its right name, the Carnegie Corporation and the Rockefeller Foundation were talking with William Langer, the head of the Research Analysis Division at the OSS, and steps were taken to find a new home for RNA in academia after the war. And Langer, remember, he's the French historian from Harvard who was the head of the RNA. Langer recalled in his memoirs receiving 2 representatives of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he wrote, "My visitors were impressed by the RNA approach to the analysis of complicated situations, and in the course of lengthy discussions, raised the question of whether some similar system might not be introduced in our universities." And that's precisely what happened. Engerman, in 2004, Engerman is the historian at Yale, noted, in 1943, the Rockefeller Foundation hosted a small conference on Slavic studies that brought together a dozen leading Slavic experts, many of whom were active in campus-based training programs for the military. As one participant and later Columbia faculty member wrote, I'd love to know who it was, the main emphasis of a new field of Slavic studies should be to create and disseminate knowledge about the importance of the, quote, Slavic peoples in the world's culture, politics, and economics. The discussions frequently cited the USSR's role in the post-war economy and the opportunities for expanding U.S.-Soviet trade relations after the war. That's the end of the quote from Engerman. At the same time, Geroid Robinson, I mentioned him, he was the head of the USSR division within RNA, and he was from Columbia. So at the same time, Geroid Robinson was discussing with Columbia the possibility of moving his Soviet OSS group to Columbia after the war was over. So he'd be going back to Columbia with his study group. Quote, by the end of 1945, before the ink was dry on the presidential order that disbanded the Office of Strategic Services, plans were secure to relocate the USSR division in Morningside Heights. And if you don't know New York, Morningside Heights is where Columbia University is, where it became the first of the nation's area institutes of graduate studies. Its doors opened on September 25th, 1946, and Geroid Robinson was the first director. David Engerman, the Yale historian I mentioned a moment ago, wrote, "From its beginnings, the Columbia program emphasized training over research, the reproduction of knowledge over the production of new knowledge. In 1944, while Robinson was still leading the OSS's USSR division, he argued that Columbia could perform a useful national service by, quote, doing all that an academic program can do to prepare a limited number of American specialists to understand Russia and Russians. The RI's founding document," that's the institution being set up at Columbia, the RI, the Russian Institute, "the RI's founding document reiterated this claim, recognizing the expansion of instruction on Soviet topics. Geroid Robinson insisted that the most urgent task was, quote, to raise the standard of existing instruction in this field and to promote research interest among those who carry on instruction. Much to Robinson's continuing dismay, the RI, Russian Institute at Columbia, the RI's research program never reached the same level as Harvard's." That's an important point. Don't forget that. The RI's MA program and master's program, in particular, aimed to train Russia experts for work in government agencies. In the argot of Sovietology, references to unspecified government agencies, quote unquote, usually meant the CIA, though it could include the State Department. This training regimen included significant work in the humanities because, as Robinson put it, the Soviet Union exhibited, quote, an extraordinary degree of uniqueness in the major elements of its life and thought, unquote. Careful analysis of Russian culture and ideas became essential. Columbia's orientation then called for a major augmentation of humanities offerings, including both languages and history. End of quote from David Engerman. Teaching the Russian language became a top priority for Columbia University as soon as it was committed to opening the Russian Institute, and it established a department of Slavic languages with the same stroke of the pen. The chair of the new department was Ernest Simmons, who was lured away from Cornell University, where he had run a Russian language institute for federal and military personnel during World War II. A recent study noted the following. From numerous studies of the so-called state-private network in U.S. society, exchanges such as these appear typical of the early Cold War years, when the concerns and interests of private philanthropical foundations, corporate entities, and covert or overt state agencies coalesced. Their mission was to immunize the United States, its allies, and non-allied nations against the Kremlin's propaganda and advances, and to remedy the biases so many elites in the world held vis-a-vis the American way of life. Many, but not all, of those who staffed or came to staff the Ford and Rockefeller foundations in the immediate post-war years had worked in the military, intelligence, or governmental positions concerned with the reconstruction and economic recovery of Europe. End of quote. And so, in 1946, a new Department of Slavic Languages was created at Columbia University, including Roman Jakobson as professor. A year later, Simmons, the new chair at Columbia, was able to obtain funding from Czechoslovakia to establish a Tomáš Masaryk chair of Czech studies to honor the memory of the first president of Czechoslovakia. Masaryk was a philosopher, a strong supporter of linguistics and of the Prague linguistic circle in particular, and a great admirer of the United States. He was married to an American woman. Jacobson was the first professor to hold that chair, and as things turned out, he was the last professor as well. In any event, Jacobson quickly gathered around him a group of American students interested in the Russian language and Russian culture, and among them was Morris Halle. Morris Halle was born in 1923 into a middle-class Jewish family in Libau, Latvia. His family aligned with Weimar German culture, and the language that he spoke at home was German. Latvian and Russian began in second grade in his school, where the language of instruction was German. But when Hitler came to power in 1933, the anti-Semitism in the school became acute, and he had to transfer to a Jewish school where the language of instruction was Hebrew. He learned Yiddish along the way, a language that was still spoken by older people in his family, and English he learned in Gymnasium, which is to say in high school. Around 1934, as the impact of Hitler's rise to power in Germany became evident in the Baltic states, Halle's father reached the decision that moving to the United States was imperative as it was difficult. He would have to raise $10,000 to show the American authorities that he would not be a financial burden if he and his family arrived in the United States. By 1937, they were in a position to apply for a visa, but the demand was heavy, and there were only 300 visas issued each year, so it was not until 1940 that the family's request was successful. And by then, the war in Europe had begun. The Soviet Union had begun to occupy major parts of Latvia militarily. Halle's family left in April, at the very last possible moment, and the family reached New York as Germany marched into France. The family that Halle had left behind in Latvia suffered the fate of so many. They were killed by the Nazis. In New York, Halle completed high school, started studying engineering, and was soon drafted. He was sent to the European front in 1945, and he served as an interpreter for military intelligence in France. Once back home, and clear in his head that his multilingual background could serve as the basis for a reasonable career, he turned his sights to Russian literature and went to the University of Chicago. George Bobrinskoy, a Russian count and a Sanskritist, was head of the Russian program when he arrived. Halle was befriended in short order by Giuliano Bonfante, a professor of Indo-European who was visiting from Princeton University. And it was Bonfante who pointed him to Roman Jakobson at Columbia University, suggesting that that was where Halle ought to go study. After finishing his master's degree at University of Chicago, he transferred to Columbia and didn't see Jacobson at all his first semester. But then Jacobson was seriously injured by a drunk driver, and he had to stay in a hospital for a very long time. It was a full year before he walked again. And terrible misfortune for Jacobson became a wonderful opportunity for Halle, who served as Jacobson's assistant and amanuensis during this time. This served as a fine opportunity to get to know Jacobson, and there were many opportunities for conversation, as Halle would help an invalided Jacobson get mundane matters accomplished. This relation eventually turned into a friendship that lasted till the passing of Jacobson in 1982, and a professional relationship of deep and mutual respect over all those years. One of Jacobson's students at Columbia, Lawrence Gaylord Jones, remembered the following. His course in Russian phonology was particularly outstanding since he was beginning serious work on his theory of distinctive features. But it became wildly exciting for reasons which later generations would never suspect. First of all, in those days, in the field of linguistics, phonology was the most popular level of linguistic analysis. In the area of Russian linguistics, there was even more of a reason. The phonemic status of the vowel that we transcribe with a Y, but which is really the sound I. That's me, John Goldsmith, saying that. The phonemic status of I was a burning issue. Opposite camps were drawn up in this battle, and they were drawn up along the lines of political ideology. While Jacobson was arguing that I was a contextual variant of E, the Soviets were claiming that two are independent phonemes. While we were at Columbia, a linguistic controversy was raging within the Soviet Union, and in the end, no less than Joseph Stalin became the chief arbiter of affairs linguistic. I'm going to draw this particular video to a close now, but there's lots more interesting stuff, and I will continue in part 2 of this discussion of Europe comes to New York. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.